Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pathway to 17 Summit and the session DPI, a key to digital inclusion and equity. My name is Fahad Shahab, and I am a certified digital finance practitioner and a subject matter expert of the IDIT course by Digital Frontier Institute. The topic we will discuss in the next 45 minutes is around DPI, digital public infrastructure, and how it is key to inclusive digital economic development across countries. We have our esteemed panelists today with us, and I would like to ask each one of them to introduce themselves. So, if Sabine can introduce herself.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Sabine Mensah. I'm Deputy CEO for AfricaNenda, and AfricaNenda is a team of digital finance and financial inclusion experts based on the continent, working with central banks, government agencies, private sector association, and other enablers to really develop and scale up inclusive payment systems in Africa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. David?
Thanks, Fahad. Also a pleasure. Nice to see you, Fahad, and to be with you again. I've been involved in working in digital economies in different capacities for a while, involved in setting up digital frontiers. But the last couple of years, I founded an entity called Integral Governance Solutions, which focuses on thinking about this question of governance in a couple of domains. One of those domains is public-private partnership issues. And that's really what's taken me into this area of DPI. And that's where I've been engaged in a number of conversations and different actions in the past year or two in particular. Thanks, Fahad.
Thank you so much. So let's jump into the session. So let's start with the fundamental question to our panelists. So what is digital public infrastructure, which is called DPI, and digital public goods, DPG? And how does it relate to inclusive digital economy? So I would ask David to first, ponder on this question.
Sure, Fahad, I'm happy to. And there's been lots of pondering on this question. Believe me, I'm hoping that the pondering is less ponderous and becoming clearer as we move down the track here. But Fahad, the big thing for me is in some ways asking why we need a definition, right, as a starting point, because the need for a definition will shape the precision of a definition. If it's because of a regulatory purpose, that's very different from if it's for advocating something. And I realize you're asking, as you said, just as a foundation for today's conversation, I just want to add one more reason for this definition, which will give you a perspective on why I think this way. And that is to avoid DPI, digital public infrastructure, simply being essentially another branch of GovTech, right? So GovTech is a field which has been around for a while, dealing with how governments deploy technology in interacting with their citizens. Very important, very necessary. There's a lot going on, but I would argue that DPI is different from that. And so part of the purpose of a definition is to say, well, how? What does it mean to think DPI that's different? So for me, as I think about DPI, I think about those three words, digital, public, and infrastructure. And the digital part we tend to take for granted, right? We think that's easy, although frankly, it's not always as easy as you think to put precision around that term. But let's not go there today. I don't think that's our main concern. The issue of P, the public part of DPI, I think there is increasing convergence, Fahad, which says that the P part doesn't refer to government ownership necessarily as being required. It refers to public purpose. And so I'm very pleased to see in the more recent definitions coming out of the G20 process, which India chaired recently, as well as definitions by the likes of Co-Develop, an agency that promotes DPI, there's an acceptance that we're not talking P equals state ownership or direct control. We certainly are talking oversight, because if there's a public purpose involved, there is a case for oversight, but it's not about ownership. So I'm pleased that the P is getting clearer. And then we're on the I, the last I. And frankly, that's I think, the vaguest and the most open-ended of the parts of the definition, because let's be frank. When we talk about infrastructure, meaning physical infrastructure, we're also pretty vague, right? We know it when we see it. We think a road or a bridge is physical infrastructure, but really, what's the difference? We aren't always that careful. So what tends to happen with infrastructure, Fahad, is we give examples. We say, well, what we mean is things like roads or airports or harbors or something like that. And that's what's happening in DPI. We give examples. So we say we mean payment systems or digital identity systems or data exchange systems. But frankly, I think that's a very restrictive definition, and I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful other than in a very vague way, because it tends to box DPI. People tend to think, well, that's where it starts and finishes, these 3 blocks. And I think there's a lot more to it than that, especially when you talk data exchange. I mean, goodness me, put that in a box? No way in the world today. That's out of the box in all sorts of ways. But even more importantly, I think the reason I don't like thinking of it in those terms is because it also brings us back to what we know. And it risks what we're doing here is just relabeling things that we already talk about, right? So AfricaNenda has been working with digital payment systems for a while. So why do we have to call them DPIs now, right? That doesn't seem to add a lot of value. So for me, Fahad, just to bring this to a conclusion, on the infrastructure side, I'd like us to be clear that we're talking about systems which can be used for others as well. In other words, for use cases beyond the immediate ones for which they were perhaps originally intended. That opens the aperture and the lens. I think we're also talking infrastructure which is multilateral. In other words, that allows multiple forms of participation in it. I think that matters as well. And so for me, frankly, where I come out in thinking about these definitions, which are converging, there's about interoperability, it's around building blocks, increasingly is to say, I wonder if we can really talk about a DPI. In other words, a particular system as being a DPI, or whether we should be talking about a DPI approach of where these different blocks get joined together. And at the level of the blocks, we should be talking about their DPI readiness. How ready are those blocks to be part of this bigger picture? Because we all know, and Sabine, I'm sure, can comment on this, that not every payment system actually is really DPI ready. A lot of them are islanded and they sit there in glorious splendor on their own, but they're not DPI ready. So that's what I would suggest as we think about DPI, is to put more emphasis on the infrastructure and more emphasis on the thinking about this approach of interoperable building blocks, which really do achieve national scale public purpose. That's where I think it's different from GovTech only, and also provides us with an angle to think more broadly than just narrow categories that we relabel.
Thank you, David, for such a comprehensive, thought process and the approach which needs to be taken for DPI. Sabine, you want to chip in with your thoughts, because David did mention about the African payment systems. What do you say?
Sure, Fahad. Thank you so much, David, for this refreshing perspective on DPI. And when I think of it and the acronym, and every time that I'm asked, what is DPI, I'm thinking, just stop a minute. Take a highway. Do we ask ourselves what type of car do you have? Electric or gas? SUV, small? We don't. That highway is servicing all of us. It is infrastructure that we're leveraging for other purposes, like you said. It is infrastructure that's enabling us to transcend space and time, to enable us to do commerce, exchange. So all of that, when I look at it, for me, DPI represent a digital version of that highway that we are using in the physical world. And it is an infrastructure that is supposed to enable a wealth of benefits for consumers across the world, in countries, and putting the building blocks that are necessary for the digital economy to be as inclusive as possible and to leave no one behind in the scheme of things. And that's how I can relate to digital public infrastructure. And to your point, David, in terms of inclusivity, it's true. It's not every single payment system is inclusive. And in all fairness, in our evaluation at AfricaNenda, we found out that none of the current instant payment system are what we call a mature level of inclusivity, and a few have what we call a progress inclusivity, and a lot of it is at the very basic level of inclusivity, if we could say that. But I think it is important to take into consideration that digital public infrastructure in its intent, like you say, it is for the public interest, and it is rails that needs to be there for all of us to build on and to really accelerate the inclusion, digital, financial, across the ecosystem. But I'm not sure if you want us to talk about the inclusive governance piece, but I'm happy to chime into that as
Yes, we will do definitely. Definitely, we will ask that. So I would like to also tell the audience that we have other panelists as well. So I would like Kamya to introduce herself as well.
Hi, thank you so much, Fahad. Great to be here with everyone. My name is Kamya Chandra. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure, which is a global academic center that is designed to help countries in their technology architecture and offer, pro bono advice. So we are philanthropically funded as an institute. And personally, I've been involved over the last 8+ years on the design and rollout of what's now called DPI. Back then, it was just inclusive identity, inclusive signatures, inclusive payments, inclusive data sharing. So that's kind of the background that I come from. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes, Victor, are you here? So let me jump to the question to Kamya. What role do government, public-private partnerships, and civil society organizations play in promoting DPI for digital inclusion?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and jumping just off of David's framing of digital public and infrastructure. I think the interesting thing about DPI is that it's digital, but its access can be digital, physical, or phygital. It's public, but it's in public interest, not necessarily public ownership. So this gets to your question about the role of public and private, and it's infrastructure because someone else can reuse it, right? Because somebody outside can use it to offer a service better. Not just a citizen can use it, which is the traditional e-government services, but rather an institution like a bank or a mobile money provider, or let's say a hospital, or any kind of health tech or fintech or any kind of private app can actually reuse it. So this question of who builds and who benefits from is truly a community question. I think DPI, it's not that as though something is like a yes/no for whether something is DPI. It's definitely a grayscale for are your digital assets operating more and more and more like well-designed DPI on that grayscale. And I think on the furthest along on that grayscale, you'll see that you see some degree of public involvement. In the case of data sharing, for example, the role of the public sector in that case is to actually publish the open standards that are required for data sharing, right? And to maybe create a regulatory framework as well. And then you'll see the role of market players and community players really come to life, because a market player will have to, let's say, as a technology service provider, go in and onboard every individual entity that's complying to those standards or using those standards as the highway to be able to share information, right? And market players will actually be the entities that are sharing and providing information. So, and as well as the final layers, you'll see market players or even community players as open source that might create reusable components for tech partners to use in bringing a market player on board. So actually, the reason DPI is quite different from what we've framed as originally e-government or digitization approaches, and the reason payment so readily fits, that framing, is because it's by design a system or an ecosystem or a network of networks for many players to interact in a digital economy. And so as such, I think the role of government actually in a DPI approach might be to do slightly less than they do in a traditional digital government project, right? In a digital government project, their role might be to not just publish the standards, but to build a portal, to build an app, and to get traffic on that app, for example, right? But a DPI approach might say, no, all you may need to do is to kind of publish the API for a service or an ability like authenticating an individual or initiating a payment, right? And then allow for a network, of market players to actually adopt that, to reuse it, to repackage it, to innovate on the user experience, to actually get to the end customer. So I think two framings. First is that DPI by design is about a digital economy, not just digital government. And second, in order to make that happen, it requires less in terms of individual action by government, but perhaps more orchestration than they're used to doing of the private sector to kind of say, let's coalesce around this standard, let's get feedback on this standard, let's get a first few adopters of the standard and actually trigger others to do rather than to do themselves. So I guess that's the brief answer to your question.
Thank you, Kamya. So, a very interesting perspective. So, I would like to ask one more question to David. How do governance principle ensures both inclusivity and security in DPI? And what are the key considerations for achieving this balance?
Well, but so when we talk about governance, it's probably worth making the distinction between what people would normally regard as external governance. So that would be regulatory oversight, typically a function of a government agency, in the case of payments, typically a central bank, right? And internal governance, which is how entities themselves go about making decisions to function. Now, I think in the case of DPI, you need both. The enshrining of public purpose and the scale at which they operate means I think there is a need for an accountability to an external reference point, and that accountability has to function well. Now, in terms of the principles under which that might happen, I've been really interested to think back on how international principles evolved around payments in a proportionate way, very interestingly, very different from, say, banking, right? Where as soon as you become a bank, you are subject to a whole lot of regulations and you're supervised as such. Whereas the approach in payments, I think, is probably more relevant to DPI broadly, which is to say, actually, it depends on your scale and what the risks are connected with what you do. So if you start getting to what's called systemic scale as a DPI, then you should be subject to governance principles, external and internal, which are quite demanding. The reason is simple. If things go wrong, there will be a lot of consequences for an economy or for a society if that happens. But until you get there, there's a case for allowing flexibility and proportionality. Because one of my concerns, frankly, and I'd be interested to know my fellow panelists what they think, but is so many DPIs are stillborn. They never get to what we would like them to get to. They just don't function effectively. I know, Sabine, in the area of payment systems, we've certainly seen a graveyard of attempts that have been made and have not reached the success of UPI in India or PIX in Brazil or whatever your favorite example is. So for me, the governance principles, Fahad, are those which enable the balancing of the interests around a scheme. And in any public-private scheme, the balancing is very tricky to do well, right? It's too easy to put too much emphasis on, for example, the oversight in ways that limit the agility that's necessary to succeed here. So I would like to see a governance framework of principles for DPI, which is evolutionary. In other words, it changes as they change in scale over time and is proportionate. It really recognizes that the risks are different. For example, if you're dealing with forms of digital identity, which capture all forms of sensitive biometrics in digital format, that requires particular oversight in ways that perhaps other forms of DPI don't carry quite the same risks. So the governance principles should be about ensuring how do we see these systems emerge? They have to be born somewhere and develop over time to get to the systemic scale, which we hope they would get to, but in a way that is safe, that's sound. And then, of course, you mentioned inclusive, balancing all the issues that go with business model and inclusion, which are necessary for success.
Thank you, David. Sabine, you want to have a perspective on this question related to governance principle, inclusivity, and security?
Absolutely. And I would take it down to particularly the payment space for instant payment systems. And, too often the question of inclusivity, people look at it as a yay or nay. Yes, it's inclusive, or no, it's not inclusive. For us at AfricaNenda, we prefer to say it depends. We feel that it is a spectrum along which you build on the inclusivity as you go and as you tailor it to governance principle, to customer centricity, to functionalities that are offered to consumers throughout the scheme as you built it. So when we started last year, as we were trying to assess the landscape of instant payment systems in Africa and also assess what could potentially be our interventions and how additive or we can bring additionality into the market for different stakeholders, it was important to us to define what inclusivity meant in instant payment systems. And as we stand, we feel that there are several levels of inclusivity, and it goes from basic, progress, or mature. But let me drill down on how we even define inclusive governance for us within the context, again, of an instant payment scheme. So we were looking at it from several angles, one of them being fair access. So that story of leveling the playing field for all financial service providers, whether they're a bank or non-bank, to contribute to the question of financial services available to customer is a key one. And therefore, as a national instant payment scheme or a regional one, it should favor fair access for all financial service providers within the country or the region. And not only fair access, we also think equal input opportunity is very important. Too often, and when we look at it from an Africa perspective, most of the instant payment schemes are governed by central banks and commercial banks. While the fintechs, we could bring that layer of innovation. The non-banks, we could bring these very tailored services for the poor, are typically indirect participant and typically have no input on the decisions of the scheme at the national level. So that equal input opportunity, a mechanism that enabled the system to push back to the ecosystem and the participant decisions that they're looking at making and gather some inputs with regard to this decision before taking the decision is equally important in the governance of the scheme. We also feel like, the central bank being part of that governance framework is key because as a body which typically is engaged in financial inclusion, has national or regional financial inclusion strategy, it is by far probably the actor who can elevate the question of inclusivity into the instant payment scheme and can also champion this equal opportunity, this fair access, and through even instruments that the schemes are using, enabling integrations for all PSPs and making sure that it's a specific focus on the inclusive mandate that the national financial inclusion or regional financial inclusion is promoting, and also preventing perhaps a dominance of some of the commercial interests within the discussions of the scheme because of the position of some of the incumbents into the ecosystem. I think that piece is also quite key from our perspective. And as we're looking at gauging the inclusivity of these different instant payment systems in Africa, inclusive governance is a key one in our evaluation, in addition to inclusive functionality, so available to all, accessible to all, regardless of which means you have, basic smartphone, whatever that is. That is also part of what we call the inclusive functionalities. And at the end of the spectrum for us, when you move to that mature level of inclusivity, we are assuming that you have the inclusive functionality, you have the inclusive governance piece, and now you're really drilling down into how to make your system as consumer-centric as possible by making sure that all the use cases are accessible and making sure that there is a recourse mechanism from a consumer protection perspective, that it is affordable from a cost level, and really offering the best opportunities for financial inclusion.
Thank you so much. Such a comprehensive reply of this question. So let's also, just to elaborate, let's jump to a few examples of countries which have taken the approach of DPI. So I would like to ask Kamya, Can you discuss example of successful DPI initiatives that have significantly improved digital inclusion? You can touch on India, Brazil, Thailand, Kenya, and why do you think that this country has achieved the success in DPI approach, on which hasn't so far?
You're going to make me call out which haven't. That's a little political, but I'm going to stick to the ones that have, and with the knowledge that the ones that have are constant sort of inspirations. And I really believe that if we have across 190 countries, nearly every country has built a successful DPI in one sector or the other. And we've got some, you can really draw out, like I'm in Dhaka at the moment, right? And they've built a foundational identity that covers 19+% of adults, and they've got an electronic KYC capability, which uniquely, for the governance framing, for example, they've built a different institution that has built authentication and eKYC as a layer on top of the ID, because they separated out the capacity, and it's actually a private body called it's called Porteous, and it builds on the national ID. So just to say that I think there are many, many success stories in many countries. I think the thing that unites them is what we call DPI. So the thing that we call DPI is actually not ID payments data, because as Sabine said, many payment systems have not inclusively scaled to the local street vendor. As David mentioned, your passport has not scaled to your whole population in most countries, right? So what is it, going back to David's point, is the DPI approach that has actually made these different systems operate as infrastructure. And the examples, are very well known. I think on foundational ID, India is probably a strong example of a country that reached a population that nobody thought was possible. I mean, the only other ID systems or systems that covered 1 billion people before Aadhaar were like Facebook and Google. So it was just unimaginable to reach that scale. So the fact that they managed to cover, I think, 1 billion people in a foundational ID that focused not on the card, which is so often the focus, right? If they'd gotten into this trap of creating a smart card, it would have been $20 a person, and it would have ended up with like 10 million people having it and the rest in a queue waiting for it, right? I think the fact that they went with what was accessible, which was actually a piece of paper. Everyone's national ID card in India, or national ID, digital public infrastructure, is a piece of paper with a digitally signed QR code on it. I think that perspective of saying digital is not about you having some fancy iPhone or software, etc. It's about on the back end that is robust and it's functioning and it's able to be unique, and you're able to do an authentication and electronic KYC. And on the front end, it can just be a piece of paper. And that's DPI. That's the difference between DPI and digitization. I think India drove that home with identity, and certainly with payments. I think the thinking around where can we bring in fintechs from day one as part of the governance approach. So they're part of the steering committee of the payment switch. But also, I think as driving forward inclusion from that framing, I think reaching sort of 10 billion transactions a month was not an easy feat for anyone. I think they managed to do it. On payments, I'll also call out Brazil as well, because they kind of in response, in some sense, it was response to a threat. It was WhatsApp was threatening to enter the payments ecosystem. And the central bank was like, we now need a framework to think about how to make instant payments a reality. And after that, I think they really, with capacity unheard of in most central banks, they managed to actually in-house build an extremely powerful instant payment system, which many can learn from. And now, finally, I think they're adding the final layer of the third-party fintechs as payment initiation service providers. And Brazil, I'll also call out, beyond payments, has built a very powerful open finance network as well for financial data sharing, which is up to, I think, 30 million transactions or so. So really bringing to life that hypothesis that that you actually have to share your financial data in order to access credit. And that's the unblocker. Like, you think you're going to solve credit by, pushing for credit interest subvention or guarantees or other things that are supply side. But actually unlocking data, I think they've been a very big force on that. Beyond that, I mean, I think many countries, I think Estonia has built on data sharing, a very good set of rails, which has evolved over time to include many other blocks. I think Singapore obviously has a number of blocks as well on identity payments. So I think you can pick a block, and for each block, it's an unusual bunch of countries that come up, right? I mean, even Nigeria, for example, has built identity, which I think they've got about 70 million people enrolled, and they've got an identity and electronic KYC capability built in. I know folks in Ethiopia, are using an open source project, actually, the modular open source ID project, and without in bringing in a vendor, so in-house in the NIDP at Ethiopia, they've actually enrolled, a couple 100,000 people, kicked off the work. Even before the World Bank sort of project funding had arrived, they've done all this work, in advance. So I think there's a lot of inspiration out there for teams that are really building this as per DPI design principles. And I think those principles are key to the success. So minimalism, like not trying to do too much, build something that others can reuse, build minimal sort of protocols and standards that facilitate interoperability. Don't try to be the king of the country and be in the back end, but that's how you'll scale, right? Many partners will help you scale, and they will take your transaction count up. I think there are many such implementation principles, as well as technology, market, and governance principles that are at the core of some of these countries' adoptions. And as a person in this space, I think it's a really exciting time to be working with such leaders that are so passionate about progress and success. Yeah.
Well, Kamya, we can the passion as you're speaking, it's coming out. It's amazing. I just wanted to take a minute, if you allow me to say, you said you're in Dhaka. Yesterday, I was on a panel with Bangladesh, and one of the questions was looking at also exemplars in Africa. And one example, the one that I brought up, was Ghana, with the Ghana interbank payment
settlement switch. Yeah.
And the story is such a beautiful story, because this is a story of having built different platform, eSwitch for the cards, both biometric, the instant payment with for bank system, and then the mobile money ecosystem, and working on making these three platform interconnect to each other, so you enable all-to-all interoperability. And a journey that started with 41% financial inclusion in 2010, today showing 85% financial inclusion in Ghana by 2023. So if nothing else, I think it's a testament to what you're saying, Kamya, that there are components that are being built. Countries are making a lot of efforts on different layers of the DPI, journey that we can all learn from and see how this could come together and the ecosystem itself to accelerate financial inclusion.
Thank you, Sabine.
I think, Fahad, if you'll allow me to add one thing, I think the interesting thing about these countries that are building it is not that, let's say, Brazil does everything right in all of its digital government projects, or India does everything right, or Singapore has done everything right. I think what these countries are finding is, out of the myriad efforts that have existed for digital in these countries, which is like many, right? 50 to 100 projects that are digital projects, let's say per state, per country, right? Is what probably would be close to the number. Out of these, I think the ones that have been really successful have been the ones that have been aligned to the DPI philosophy or approach. I think that's the interesting thing. It's not that Brazil is a digital superstar, or India, or Nigeria, or any of these countries, because many of these countries have had both successes and failures, public failures, in fact, for some of their digital initiatives, which never went off the ground. But the interesting thing is, from the graveyard of digital projects, I think what's missing is the projects that have pursued the DPI approach. And so they stand out as sort of the ones that there's some common thread that's driving success. I think that's the interesting thing. And so even within a country, like within Brazil, the government data sharing efforts could learn from the open finance effort, because one has kind of been more aligned with the DPI approach, and the other has maybe pursued a more traditional approach, right? And they are learning, and that learning is happening. But I think that's the interesting thing, is that even within countries, you see a lot of variation. And the department that tends to pursue this approach tends to see much more scale or success of their initiative.
Right. So just wanted to, tell you that these are the examples you have given of lots of countries which have done DPI project very well. Obviously not in the level of DPI, but in another project
Yeah.
initiative. I just wanted to mention the name of Moja Loop. So Moja Loop, and I want to ask David about that. So I know that in Pakistan, Moja Loop platform or their concept was used in State Bank RAS project. However, they didn't use the blockchain part. That was obviously I was looking for because Moja Loop was made in that way, but it became more centralized. But what do you say about Moja Loop? Is it a DPI or DPG? What is the envisioned impact?
Well, Fahad, I would say for sure for me that Moduloop is not a DPI, it's a DPG, right?
Yeah.
It's a system that is regarded as a public good. It qualifies, it's even registered under the Digital Public Goods Alliance, so it meets all of the criteria that have been set there. I would say what we could discuss is when Moduloop is implemented, like you mentioned in Pakistan and in other parts of the world, that could become an instance of DPI, depending on how that's done. Right. So a DPG can be embedded in the implementation of a DPI, and there can be advantages for that. But I think what's been really good about the conversation in this past year, Fahad, around this whole space is a recognition that DPIs don't have to be built using DPGs, right? That DPGs can make sense in particular circumstances, but they need to be considered alongside whatever the contenders might be in building DPI. And, the impact on inclusivity that you're asking about, well, the argument around DPGs is often that they are less expensive in terms of a total cost of ownership. So that could be helpful for an inclusive outcome, right? But then, of course, if their functionality is restricted in such that it doesn't meet the inclusive use cases, that's not very helpful. So that's where I would argue that one needs to look through a range of options and consider them, Moduloop being one in the payment system space for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, for explaining. I just wanted to ask. Let me ask Kameshwari. I like your passion about this subject. What are the key components of an effective DPI framework? This is important if you can, do it briefly, but with few points so that the audience can understand and they can take it from this session. The key
It's a
components
very
of an effective DPI framework.
Yeah, it's a very broad question, I think, but hopefully each audience member will apply it to their own department and their own sector and their purpose. I think there are three broad components, which I think we've highlighted earlier in this as well, are tech, governance, market, right? On the tech side, you need to make sure that you're minimalist, that you're open standards, you're interoperable, and you allow others to reuse your tech, right? So if you have, for example, if you're building a government portal, publish the APIs for that portal so that somebody else can reuse those APIs. If you're building a payment switch, make sure you have a standard payment protocol that is reusable by both fintechs and banks to build many of their apps. If you're doing data sharing or if you're doing healthcare, any of your registries that you're building in healthcare, again, open APIs, open access, digitally signed for tamper-proof, records. Some of these, I think, technology components are quite well understood. But the tech is one part, not the complete part, right? The second part is governance, which is you need to make sure that the institution that is operating the DPI or is coordinating the ecosystem around the DPI has inclusive sort of participation. So they're able to bring in different voices to be able to deliver, and they have the capacity. So sometimes you cannot also impose on an institution that has mandate X to say, okay, now build DPI Y, which is way outside of their comfort zone and growth. So you should set up the governance in a way that you bring people with capacity to execute. And if needed, make that a subsidiary, make that, in payments, they've been doing this for a while by saying you can have a payment switch that reports into your central bank, but has technical IT folks who are not your central bank economists, and that's fine, right? So I think governance is crucial to sort out to make sure that you have the right people working on the problem. For the second layer, and the final layer is that of market or market innovation. This is really the layer that differentiates a DPI from from a e-government project, are you actually orchestrating many market players to reuse what you've built and improve their service delivery? And in payments, for example, the example is often given of, are you bringing in new types of players like fintechs to innovate on the user experience? Or are you giving wallets the same access as you give your, let's say, bank accounts, right? And similarly in healthcare, are you allowing health techs to innovate based on a core registry that you've provided of facilities so they can craft their telemedicine apps that might reach, local areas better than your Ministry of Health ever could? So I think the main elements, of the framework would be get your tech right, your governance and your market right, and don't overly focus on one. I think for the tech, there are many resources, to actually reference, and they're out there. Those I think are the most reusable. On market and governance, I think each country needs to really decide for that use case what is the right adoption model. The final note I'll frame is that while you set out your DPI with like a 5-10 year vision to say this will grow and scale over 5-10 years, I think countries should try to identify one starting killer use case that's like a low hanging fruit that they can execute in 3 to 6 months, which is a really felt need among the society to be able to scale up the adoption and the usage of DPI. So if you're building ID, maybe it's a government to person benefit scheme. That's the killer use case, right? Or if you're building payments, maybe the killer use case is making a bill payment, which might be a high friction activity. But for whatever it is, if it's data sharing, it might be a small ticket loan. That might be your killer use case. For each of the DPI, I think identifying the use case will anchor you to the present while your architecture sets you up for the future.
Thank you, Kamya. It's just a very detailed, explanation of this, whole standards. There is a question as well. How can we meet the standard if we use the minimum protocol?
I think, do you want me to cover it, or Sabine, maybe you can
Yes,
come in
yes.
as well
Just
on this?
cover briefly. Just cover
Yeah.
briefly. What? How can we meet the standard if we use the minimal protocol?
Oh, I think, sorry, I thought someone, so I think one way to think about this is to say that the minimum protocol becomes the default standard. I think that's what we're trying to say here. Standard protocol, little interchange. One is a tech word, one is a policy word in some sense. But the point is that you frame the minimum standard or the minimum protocol so that many folks can build their software systems, which are end-to-end systems, but they can, as long as they're using the same protocol, they can be interoperable with each other. So the way to understand this is email, for example, is the best example, where there's a protocol, it's called SMTP protocol. And at the time of the creation of the internet, luckily they crafted this. And that's why I can send an email from Gmail and you can receive it on Yahoo and we can share it on Hotmail. And if you're really older, maybe Rediff Mail, right? So I think this combination of interoperability that you get, it means that the entity that's building DPI doesn't need to create a Gmail. It doesn't need to create its own government mail. It can just publish the standard, which is less than a page. I mean, it's a very minimal standard for what it does an email look like. And that allows many softwares to come in. And the same can be done for payments, data sharing, healthcare, registries, and many other areas.
And if I
Thank
can
you,
build on
Kamya.
what you're saying,
Yes,
the
absolutely, Sabine.
ability of interconnecting payment systems across Africa and across the world, if we were all building them around these standards and these protocols. Imagine how we will solve the interoperability equation across Africa and the world.
Yes, so we are approaching the close of the session. So I would like each one of them just to give their closing remarks on this subject and anything our audience needs to know about this subject. So I would like David to start. We have 2 minutes left right now.
Thanks, Fahad. Well, I think it's been a great conversation to pick up on. Here's the thing I'm excited about. So I think there's a lot of activity and a lot of buzz. I think the best is yet to come. I think we're only seeing the early days of what's happening here. And the best is yet to come when we see these next generation DPI applications which start linking together systems that were formerly isolated and islanded. And that's why, for me, my hope is that people listening to this and others involved with digital frontiers will be promoting that mindset, which says we want to see on that grayscale that Kamya mentioned, that DPI readiness scale, people, systems getting more and more DPI ready. Then we can really expect, I think, some exciting next generation developments around this in the next 5 or 10 years.
Sabine, you want to say something on this? Concluding
I was going to say, often technology is ahead of us. And I think technology is not the issue here. It's policy, it's regulatory environment, and it's also onboarding the ecosystem, the stakeholders having an opportunity to chime into what is happening. And that's where I think having peer learning of these exemplars that are across the globe, facilitating knowledge sharing across the ecosystem, a key component of what we could do as an ecosystem to fast track this journey. And I want to invite all of you to join us the 8th of November in Addis Ababa for the launch of the CIPS 2023 report.
Excellent. And I'll ask Kamya to tell the audience, specifically, if they want to make a career on DPI or DPG, what advice do you give to them?
I would tell them not to make it a career, but a mission. And I think if you framed it as a mission, the only advice I would give is think big rather than think small, because I think what we've seen is working hard to implement a pilot that affects, maybe if you're lucky, 500,000 or 1 million people, versus working hard to implement an infrastructure that affects millions across your whole country. They tend to take the same amount of effort. So I would just say that to folks to think big and dream big, and the tech, the resources, are here to support you if you're in that mission and really want to see that growth in your country. So happy to, of course, help. I think AfricaNenda, Digital Frontiers, as well as CDPI are all here to support countries in their journey. So think big, dream big, and reach out to us, and let's make it happen.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to thank you, everyone, to attending the session, uh, and thank you to the panelists that their valuable contribution towards this topic. And this is a huge field which is very promising right now. So watch out for all the development. I would like everyone to join Digital Public Good Alliance. It has quite a good number of resources, plus courses which Digital Frontier Institute develops for IDID. That is also very relevant for this subject. So thank you so much, and have a great day.